Before we explore today's case, a big thanks to June's Journey for sponsoring this video. Some of my favourite cases, which I've covered on the channel, have been the ones involving mysteries and uncertainties within the case. If you are like me and enjoy this element of mystery, I'm sure that you will love the free-to-download mobile game, June's Journey. It's based in the 1920s, and during the game, you search for clues and objects in a variety of spectacularly crafted scenes. As you uncover clues, you advance through the chapters and slowly but surely discover who was behind the murder of June's sister and her husband. Of course, it's full of surprises, unexpected events, and constant clue changes. This all makes it highly enjoyable. Also, you have a nice little mansion, which you expand as you play. I think it's a great game, and whenever I uncover key clues, it gets me even more hooked. Make sure you download June's Journey for free by clicking on the link below in the description. June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 20th century, so sit back as we go to South Africa. Daisy Hancorn Smith was born on the 1st of April 1886 near the town of Makanda in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. At the time of her birth, Makanda was called Grahamstown. She was part of a large family and was one of 11 children. In 1898, when she was 12 years old, Daisy went to live in the relatively large city of Bulawayo in the neighbouring country of Rhodesia, a country that today is known as Zimbabwe. Here she lived with her father and her two brothers. Her father was anxious that she received a good education and enrolled her into a boarding school in the South African city of Cape Town. During the school holidays, she would always travel to Bulawayo to visit her family. In 1903, when she was 17 years old, Daisy finished school and returned to live in Bulawayo. However, she did not plan to stay for very long, as she considered it a bit too quiet. She was now a young lady and nearly 18 years old. The start of the 20th century had been a changing time. Queen Victoria had died in 1901, and it was now the Edwardian era. The South African Second Boer War had ended in 1902, and Daisy was anxious to explore the opportunities that were now available for her. She went to the city of Durban, where she trained as a nurse in the Berea nursing home. Everything seemed good, and when she was able, she would always return to Bulawayo to see her family. On one such occasion, she met a young gentleman named Bert Fuller. He seemed very charming and well educated. He worked as a civil servant in the town of Broken Hill in eastern Rhodesia, which today is called Kabwe and is now in Zambia. They courted for a while before becoming engaged, and their wedding was set for October 1907. However, on the eve of their wedding, tragedy struck when Bert was taken ill and died. It was believed that he had contracted blackwater fever, which is a malaria infection in which red blood cells burst into the bloodstream, releasing hemoglobin directly into the blood vessels and into the urine. This frequently results in kidney failure. In his will, he had left Daisy £100, not a fortune, but more than Daisy earned in a year. Daisy was now 21 years old, and after the death of her fiancé, she returned to South Africa. She met a gentleman, 14 years her senior, named William Alfred Cowell. He was from Johannesburg and worked as a plumber. They seemed to get on well, and after a short courtship, Daisy and William married in March 1909. They lived in the Johannesburg suburb of Truefontein. The marriage seemed to be happy, but again tragedy seemed to follow Daisy. After giving birth to twins, they both died in infancy. In June 1911, she gave birth to a boy, who the couple named Rhodes Cecil. He was followed by another, who died due to an abscess on the liver. The couple's fifth child, another boy, was born in 1915, but died shortly after his first birthday, following convulsions and bowel trouble. Only their second child, Rhodes Cecil, survived. Over the next 10 years, the couple brought up their son. Daisy's husband William worked long hours But life was not easy. South Africa had entered the First World War in 1914, with many young men serving in both the South African and British military. The war years were difficult, and South Africa experienced higher inflation and a shortage of imported goods. When the war ended in 1918, there was a major influenza outbreak, which resulted in the deaths of over 300,000 people. In the early 1920s, the country's economy had somewhat recovered, and life for Daisy, William and their son became easier. By Christmas 1922, the couple had moved to the nearby city of Germiston. Daisy was 36 years old, and her husband was 48. Their son, Rode Cecil, was 11. However, tragedy would strike Daisy again, as on the 11th of January 1923, her husband, William, died. He had been attended by a doctor who was told by Daisy that she had given William some Epsom salts to relieve his pain. The doctor had not thought that William had been suffering from anything that would not resolve itself after a couple of days' rest, and he prescribed a bromide mixture. Soon after, however, William's condition had deteriorated so much that Daisy had asked the neighbours for assistance and had called another doctor. Nothing could be done, and Daisy's husband, William Alfred Cowell, died. The circumstances surrounding the death were suspicious, and the doctor who arrived after Daisy had called for assistance suspected that the deceased may have been poisoned with strychnine. He requested a post-mortem be performed. This was carried out by the acting district surgeon named Dr. Fergus. He concluded that the cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage and chronic nephritis. This is an inflammation of the kidneys. The death certificate was issued, and in his will, William left the sum of £1,795. Daisy was the sole beneficiary. Daisy was now a widow, with a young child to raise. Despite her moderate inheritance, life was not going to be easy. In the early 1920s, people had started to find work in the larger urban areas, and towns and cities were growing. The labour market had opened up for women, and as the population grew, there was a need for more nurses. Daisy, however, met another gentleman, and on the 11th of January 1926, exactly 3 years after the death of her first husband, she married for a second time. Her husband was called Robert Sproats and was 10 years her senior. They soon settled into married life. Robert worked hard, and Daisy's son, Rode Cecil, who was now nearly 15 years old, also lived in the house. However, 19 months after becoming Mrs. Daisy Sproat, her husband was taken ill. He started to experience severe muscle spasms and stomach cramps. Fortunately, he was nursed by his wife and soon recovered. A few weeks later, his pains returned, and on the 6th of November 1927, he died. A doctor named Dr. Malinick was sent to certify the death. Daisy told him that her husband had become ill after drinking a beer and explained that he had experienced the same symptoms the previous month. Dr. Malinick certified that the cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage and arterial sclerosis, which is the thickening and hardening of the arteries. The doctor did not request that an autopsy be performed, and following Robert's death, Daisy inherited over £4,000, which in 1927 was a considerable amount of money. She also received a small pension. Again, it was just Daisy and her son. This time she was in a good financial position. Over the next 3 years, Rode Cecil continued to live with his mother. Daisy was now 44 years old, and she met a gentleman named Sidney Clarence De Melker. He was a widower, and strangely worked as a plumber, which was the same occupation as her previous 2 husbands. On the 21st of January 1931, they married, and Daisy became Mrs. Daisy De Melker. They continued to live in Germiston. Just over a year later, on the 2nd of March 1932, Daisy's son Rode Cecil became ill while at work. He'd apparently been drinking coffee from a flask. It was not only the young man who was suffering, as a fellow worker named James Webster was also not well. Both were sent home, and James Webster soon recovered. Daisy nursed her son, but his condition did not improve. On the 5th of March 1932, he died. As a fit and healthy young man had suddenly become ill and died, an autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was attributed to cerebral malaria. Rhodes Cecil was then laid to rest at the New Brixton Cemetery. His mother received the sum of £100 from a life insurance policy. Although the authorities had concluded that the death of two of Daisy's husbands and her son could be explained as natural causes, a gentleman named Mr. William Sproat, who was a brother of her late second husband Robert, had begun to think that 3 deaths in such similar circumstances was somewhat suspicious. He voiced his concerns to the police. At first they were not convinced by his theories. After all, Rhodes Cecil was Mrs. De Melker's only child, so why would she poison him? The death had also been followed by an autopsy, as had the death of her second husband Mr. Robert Sproat, and the results of both did not suggest that either had been poisoned. After much persistence from William Sproat, the police agreed to investigate. They obtained permission from the courts to exhume the bodies of Mrs. De Melker's 2 deceased husbands and her recently deceased son. They began by exhuming the body of Rhodes Cecil. Although he had only recently died, it was found that his body was still in a very good state, which the pathologists instantly recognised to be one of the signs that there could be large amounts of arsenic present. The resulting post-mortem confirmed his initial thoughts. Quantities of arsenic were discovered. The police then exhumed the bodies of Mrs. De Melker's first 2 husbands, Mr. William Cowell and Mr. Robert Sproat. Both men had been dead for a number of years, but the pathologists found traces of strychnine in the vertebrae of each of the deceased. The pathologist also noted that the bones had a slightly pink colour, something that was always associated with strychnine poisoning. The police also arranged for the hair and fingernails of James Webster to be tested for traces of poison. He had fallen ill at the same time of Rhodes Cecil. The results confirmed that the young man had consumed a small amount of arsenic. The police then arrested Mrs. Daisy De Melker and charged her with murder. The papers immediately started to report the findings. The story of a 46-year-old lady who police believe was responsible for the deaths of 2 husbands and her son fascinated the public. It was headline news all over South Africa. As her picture appeared on the front pages, a chemist from the Johannesburg suburb of Truefontein, named Mr. Abraham Spilkin, came forward and informed the police that on the 25th of February 1932, he had sold Mrs. De Melker 60 grams of arsenic. The police travelled the short distance from Germiston to inspect Mr. Spilkin's poison register. They noted that the purchase had been signed by a lady who called herself Mrs. D.L. Sproat. The trial of Daisy De Melker began on the 17th of October 1932 in the High Court in Johannesburg, and for the next 30 days was the most talked about event in the country. People rushed to wait outside the court each morning just so they could get a glimpse of the accused. Many would jeer and shout, and it seemed that public sentiment was very much against her. She had chosen to be tried without a jury, so the judge, assisted by 2 senior magistrates, would decide her fate. The prosecution called a total of 60 witnesses, including experts in forensic medicine and toxicologists. The arsenic found in the body of Mrs. De Melker's son, Rhodes Cecil, was explained to the court, and the chief detective also outlined that small amounts of arsenic had been found on the flask that had contained Rhodes Cecil's coffee which he had shared with his co-worker James Webster, who was later found to have traces of arsenic in his hair and fingernails. Coffee that had been prepared by the defendant, Mrs. Daisy De Melker. The trial ended on the 25th of November, and Mrs. De Melker was confident that she would be acquitted. The judge summed up the case. He informed the court that the prosecution had been unable to prove conclusively that Mrs. De Melker's first 2 husbands, Mr. William Cowell and Mr. Robert Sproat, had died of strychnine poisoning. He said, "It does not convince me, nor does it convict the accused." However, on the charge that Mrs. De Melker had poisoned her own son, the judge informed the packed courtroom that he had come to the inescapable conclusion that the defendant was guilty. He then passed a sentence of death. When he asked the defendant if she had anything to say, she replied that she was innocent. Daisy De Melker was hanged on the 30th of December 1932 at the Pretoria Central Prison. She was then buried in an unmarked grave. To this day, People still discuss why she poisoned her only son. Some speculate that when Rhodes Cecil turned 21, he would have been entitled to inheritance from his father's estates, inheritance that Daisy may have already spent. At the trial, Rhodes Cecil's stepsister, Miss Eileen De Melker, described him as lazy and as someone who didn't really want to work, possibly because his mother had indulged him all of his life. However, there were other witnesses who thought him to be a bright and conscientious young man. Daisy's husband, Sidney Clarence De Melker, always thought his wife to be innocent. Mrs. Daisy De Melker always proclaimed her innocence, so any reasons she had for committing her crimes, she took with her to her grave. Over the last 18 months, I've received many requests to do this case, so for all of you who have asked for it in the comments section or sent me an email, I'm sorry that it's taken so long, and thank you so much for your patience. As you all know, I really value all your feedback and comments, so please leave any that you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.